Do you want to start with the idea of history, maybe? I don't know why that's coming to mind, but just understanding um, our moment and secularism and um, understanding the significance of like the conversions right now. It seems to have something to do with uh, people feeling lost in what we thought of as secular time as like automatic progress or something.
Uh,
And now people feel lost because that's not happening anymore. And so they're reaching back for this, what they perceive to be a source of cultural stability in time, ultimately. Um, because there is, even if people don't know it often and make all these utilitarian arguments for why Christianity is culturally important, what they're reaching for is an anchor in time to a particular event in history that we inherent in a sense of the importance of history, not just as endless progress, but also as a fall and redemption process. No. So, a topic that's been getting a lot of attention lately on all the stuff that I read and watch online and on my own blog, whenever I post about it, gets lots of attention is Christianity and the current um, conversion that's occurring across uh, various public intellectuals and celebrities and artists. Everybody seems to be, for a variety of reasons, drawn to this religion, which not that long ago seemed to be very uncool and very dogmatic. Oh, it's more traditional and needs to be rejected by anyone who is the slightest bit intelligent and free thinking. And now all of a sudden it's cool again. And I think you and I both kind of have ambiguous or ambivalent feelings about this because, we were talking about this before it was cool, first of all. And also the way that Christianity seems to be appealing to a lot of these converts is as a cultural phenomenon or as a memetic tool, almost like a culture war weapon that can be wielded against what they perceive to be the downfall of Western civilization or what have you. And so, in a lot of that, um, with nominal Christianity that has this patriarchal, like imperial, like nationalist energy behind it, seems to be missing the point of the Christ event. Um, and so, yeah, you and I wanted to talk about why we think not Christianity as a religion so much, but that too, but Christ as a being and the Christ event as a moment in history, a turning point in time, why that's important. And then maybe once we've understood that, we can talk about its cultural and civilizational importance, right?
yeah, yeah, and we are partially thinking with other people, just that kind of general crowd that you've just referenced, but also more specifically, a couple Substack posts. One of them that was really great, "Believe for Your Own Sake, Not for the West" by Tara Burton. And one of the things that she's like she's sympathizing with the reasons that certain individuals, like another one of the posts we're thinking with is Jules Evans, The Dark Side of the Christian Revival. And in his post, he has these screenshots of tweets from Elon Musk, who's just one example of this kind of utilitarian approach to like emphasizing the importance of Christianity for Western values,
Yeah.
uh, and as a kind of social technology. And she's basically like, Tara Burton. Uh, she says that the potentially the worrisome thing about this is that that there's it's not flowing from this emphasis on like the truth, I guess, or like the kind of metaphysical reality that comes with the Christian faith, but just this utilitarian approach. And, to draw on, a thinker who has given language to kind of help to understand why this might be problematic. We could use Charles Taylor's notion of moral sources. And so, like these, the values of liberal society, this emphasis on the human dignity and this ideal of extending beneficence to all of human beings emerging out of this kind of Christian mythos, it and this connection to a non-competitive form of transcendence, in connection with which each like human being can have this sort of personal relationship with, but which we all share non-competitively, that being sort of like the basis of this rationale for the aspiration of beneficence, that if it's not really connected with the real event of Christ's life and death and resurrection, as a moral source, then it's just a social technology and it will not ultimately um, maintain morale, or like eventually it, yeah, it will not, um, I guess, hold forth.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm we're also thinking with Brendan Graham Dempsey and I've been in dialogue with him a few times about this and we had a conversation that we titled Christ After Christianity. And I wonder if you would agree that the religion of the various religions of Christianity, I mean, there's so many, Catholic Church, and then this proliferation of Protestant churches, and evangelical movements, mostly in the United States, but the Eastern Orthodox, like so there's these varieties of religion, and then there's a way in which we can understand religion purely as a cultural phenomenon. Um, but it would seem that if we're at all going to take any of these traditions on their own terms, whether the forms of Christianity or any of the other world religions, there's something ontological going on. There's something that's not just
Hmm.
um, a symbolic construct, or that in fact the symbols are themselves expressions of a revelation. The rituals are an expression of a revelation, and they weren't like there's a there's a way of reducing religion to a sociological phenomenon or to um, something that has no transcendent referent. And I wonder how many of the converts to cultural Christianity or memetic Christianity, like Peter Thiel, for example, does he think that the Christ being descended from the sun to save the human being and the earth from the, you know, from the fall and the clutches of materialism and death? Or does he just think the idea of Christ as the scapegoat who didn't deserve it is valuable for organizing our society? And I think obviously it's the latter, right?
Hmm.
And so what does that say then about all of these religious institutions that people affiliate themselves with? Um, or just even labels like I'm a Christian, um, which I think is different than the label like I'm a philosopher, because there's built into the term philosophy like a longing for wisdom, not a possession of it. But when you refer to yourself as a Christian, maybe you're just saying you're a follower of Christ, but um, there seems to be something, there's a bigger ask when when you encounter Christ as a being than just follow me. Um, because that's, I mean, I guess what I'm trying to open up here for us to talk about is the difference between the metaphysical status of Christ as a being and the religious forms which have evolved through history and taken various cultural shapes um, in our attempt to institutionalize that being in our encounter with that being. And I don't think I haven't heard too much discussion of the Christ being in all of this sense making about conversion to Christianity.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think as you in your conversation with Brendan and as Tara Burton notes at the end of her post, Christ, like the Christ uh, in the Bible, the was not like a friend to the certain social conventions and institutions that are, that these proponents of the more social technology interpretation of Christianity think that Christianity um, can maintain if it is sort of leveraged in that way. And um, and I think, I guess, with maybe more like Jordan Peterson types, like there's this association. Maybe I haven't read his book, so this isn't really fair for me to say about him. So I don't know if this is accurate, but it seems like there's this difference between like having a personal relationship with Christ, as a being that one um, recognizes as a reality and not just an idea, um, and and one that sort of frees us from having to mechanically follow rules, but out of the context of our every moment, act out of love. Like I would say that's what having a relationship with Christ means. And so there's this kind of anarchic aspect to being in relationship with Christ. And it has this, at least as the thinkers that I find myself resonating with, that also seem to be resonant with some of the earliest Christian thinkers, that this very like imminent relationship with Christ, to the extent that like it's just in that our everyday moments, has like a kind of uh, significance for the restoration of the world. So like significance of Christ, right, is bound up with a notion of the world as being fallen, and what people like Peter Thiel make evident in their sort of association of Christianity as um, giving this kind of affirmation to transformation, which I do think is accurate. But he says something like in this quote that Tara Burton has of him in her post um, about trying to realize the kingdom of heaven on earth. And I would say that that is a kind of translation of Christianity into more finite, imminent concerns when actually it definitely includes that, but it also exceeds that in that this vision of the es eschatological restoration of the world is exceeds earthly flourishing,
Yeah.
and so like it's not actually. I mean, there's various interpretations of Christianity, but its main focus isn't necessarily to actualize paradise on earth, and it may not actually be possible. Um,
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think the Silicon Valley technologists and oligarchs who are turning to cultural Christianity are seeking, I mean, there's something about the incarnational vector that can become mistaken for an affirmation of, yeah, like transhumanism, where, oh, the body is resurrected, so why not pursue Like if Christianity is permitting human bodies to be resurrected, why not pursue the technological enhancement and functional immortality of the physical body through, these means that are being developed currently in Neuralink and other companies. And so there's a way in which like Teilhard de Chardin's work can be appropriated, so that the noosphere, which for him was a spiritual reality that involved a communion of hearts, of human hearts, yeah, maybe scaffolded by technology, but what Teilhard was envisioning as um, a form of spiritual communion got reduced to and literalized as the internet. This digital medium is the noosphere. This digital information medium is the noosphere, which it's only it's a literalization of what Teilhard was talking about, I think, and it misses the deeper interior transformation that he was talking about. It's not just the transformation of nature in a materialist sense. It's the transformation of nature also in a spiritual sense where, we recognize that it's not just raw material waiting for us to reverse engineer, but nature is um, the work of the gods. And, Taylor talks about this, how Christianity, like secularism is an outgrowth of the Christian conception of the soul and its relationship to society. Like um, secularity is not opposed to Christianity. It's an expression of it.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah,
and so we
because partially right, because to like really be a Christian, it's not something you're like you can be compelled to do because it's something you only really do out of your own personal freedom because it's a personal relationship, even though you can come into communion with others through that.
Mhm. Right. Yeah. And
So
then
like just real quick, this like, Taylor talking about like his third sense of secularity, like in a secular age, that what's really one of the really significant things about secularity is that it creates this open space for belief and unbelief to coexist so that human beings can be free to choose, you know and
hmm,
that's sort of like a fuller actualization of Christianity, you could say.
right. Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting to think about the difference between someone, say, born into Catholicism. They just, their family was Catholic and they grew up observing in that way versus someone who converts later in life. And I know there's like a whole, you know, um, emic psychology of that, how it works for Catholics. Like, oh, the converts are here, and like they're different, how they relate to it. Um, and so might it be that, yeah, conversion later in life, clearly it usually happens because you have an encounter with the Christ, or you really have a metanoia, whereas someone who's just born into it, maybe they believe, but they have never been able to sort of encounter firsthand why they should believe. They just believe because that's what everyone around them that they care about does. Um, and so that difference of the encounter with this being, I think, speaks to the difference between um, the religious form and its cultural effects and the ontology of this being. And I think that's that's what I would love to like dig into a little bit is how are we to understand something that was both particular, a particular man in Palestine 2,000 years ago, um, is crucified after having, a brief ministry, and there are all these other stories we have about what he did and what he said, and um, all sorts of disputes about how accurate all of that is. But it's clear that there were a lot of people who saw something happen, and it was transformative for them, and they were willing to die to defend it, and wouldn't recant or say that it didn't happen, even if they were being tortured. Um, and so clearly. an event occurred which in some ways toppled an empire eventually, not through brute force, but through a transformation of souls, right? And so, okay, that's a historical event. This particular man, Jesus of Nazareth, but then there's also this Christ being, this solar logos uh, entity that came to the earth and participated in that event with as Jesus. And so, like, if we're gonna take this seriously, we to what extent can we understand that? And to what extent do we just have to relate to it with a kind of faith and like mystical unknowing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something, that both of these writers, Jules Evans, he talks about how he had his own sort of phase of conversion to Christianity, and it was actually that aspect that he just found too incredible. And I was like, oh, incredible. When you like realize the older meaning of the word. Uh,
Hmm.
and whereas Tara, she's also emphasizing that, and they're both recognizing like that this is really, what's essential about genuine Christianity, even if you waver in the faith about it, because it is, at least for, like those of us conditioned by an, out of a secular context, like secular materialist scientific
Right.
conditioning, it's absurd. You know, it's absurd, and but it also like I think when it really hits you, like if if there is any kind of mystical experience that one has, or for like I think even though I personally have had what I would say is a kind of mystical experience, I think like even just reading someone like Barfield or or
Hmm.
or Charles Taylor's texts, that this sort of um, the way that it changes how you like a late modern person feels towards history, it infuses it with so much more meaning. And
Hmm.
um, so yeah, I think there is an aspect of it that is, like I was talking to one of my friends, and he was like, that I went to high school with, and he grew up Catholic and is not. I think he's probably an agnostic, or he's maybe has spiritual, like inclination, but he's not. He was like, "So are you still a Christian?" And he just also had noticed that a lot of people had converted recently,
Hmm.
and he was like, "So you think that like God became a human?" And I was like, "Yeah." And he was like, "Well, I just can't. I just have to agree to disagree with you." And I was like, "Yeah, that's fine. I get it." Like I'm not
Yeah.
gonna try and convince anybody of it. So anyway, yeah, it's like a long response to your question, I guess. But
Yeah. I don't try to convince anyone of it either, but how do we convince? I mean, I do have reasons myself, but they're hard to they don't convince other people often. Like the Trinity, there's a logic to it, but
yeah,
there's also you have to like you have to have an experience of that intimate relationality that's so intimate it's almost a transcendent relationality before that the logic of the Trinity is going to make any sense to you. It's almost like the heart or the heart or the imagination as an organ has to first behold the beauty of the Trinity before your mind can then grasp it, the reason or the logic that um, is also operative in it. Um, which I guess is just another way of talking about like participatory knowing. Um, you can talk historically and metaphysically about the Christ event and make rational sense of it, but that's only going to count as rational if you already have a sort of experientially grounded faith right? And a heart orientation to the reality of the event. If you don't have that, none of the reasons make any sense. But there are reasons. You know, um, there is a logic to this. Um, but yeah, it is incredible, and it's incredible because of scientific materialism, which is the default common sense. And so you can't even begin to imagine God becoming human or, something like the solar logos even making any sense if you're a materialist. But it's also difficult to believe because of like the existence of evil in human history. Um, like if there's a God that saved us all, like why are we all still suffering so much and why is there so much hatred? And there are good reasons like human freedom, to explain that. But um, maybe if I could read something from Teilhard, actually, this might be a good place to point out.
Yeah, I'm just gonna turn my heat on real quick.
Yeah.
I can hear you though.
Well, he was a stretcher bearer, right, in the First World War, and his his like vision of Christ. He was born Catholic and became a priest, but um, his vision of Christ, his mystical vision of Christ, really came to him on the front lines of World War One, and so it's in the midst of war and um, all of that carnage that his faith in the triumph of love actually was strengthened. And so he has a whole book of letters that he wrote during the war, but this is one of them. Towards the end, July 1918, he says, and he's like writing his prayers basically. Isn't a letter to anyone, it's just letter to himself, you could say. He says, was there ever, my God, a humanity more like in the shedding of its blood to a sacrificed victim, more ready in its ferment to receive creative transformation, more rich in what it unleashes, in energy that can be sanctified, more close in its agony to the supreme communion? So, middle of World War One, and he's writing about how you know, the human is the sacrificed victim. How could we be more ready to receive creative transformation? And so, like, even in the human being brought to that extremity of evil, in a sense, in the midst of this nationalistic war, um, for no other reason than nationalist pride. Like that's the whole reason for the whole war, right? Um, Even in that, he's seeing the light of Christ somehow. Um, and so this issue of sacrifice, I think, really it's one of the things that makes like liberal intellectuals and progressives kind of turn away from Christianity, like because it seems so like unnecessary. Like, why do you need to sacrifice somebody to save to absolve the sins? Like it seems so archaic. Um, Maybe sin is the only other traditional Christian concept that's more hated by like the average liberal intellectual progressive person. Um, but in both of those, sacrifice and sin, um, I think there's something deep like about moral ontology and how we understand like if value is a reality is based in the cosmos, then we should really try to understand sacrifice. And like it's one of the things that draws me to Steiner's cosmogony or evolutionary cosmology, where everything begins in what he calls the Saturn phase, right? In the sacrifice of the thrones, that this very high member of the angelic hierarchies performs this deed of sacrifice in honor of the cherubim, like a higher member of the hierarchies, and that that sacrifice like gives rise to time, which like gets the whole thing in motion, and so like and then that gets repeated in every phase of evolution. That sacrifice, in order for there to be something new created, something has to be sacrificed, and it's like a deep moral logic of the whole cosmos. And if human beings turn away from the creative significance of sacrifice, which is our whole culture nowadays is driven, and materialism is driven by this idea that like I don't have to give up anything. I'll just get more. It's the opposite of a sacrificial culture. But yeah, what do you think about all that? Like the importance of shifting our relationship to this notion of sacrifice as a source of moral direction rather than as like something we don't want to look at or talk about.
Well, so, thinking with Steiner and Barfield, and also someone like Maximus the Confessor, who was it the fifth century after?
It sounds right.
I could be wrong. It's somewhere in the first millennium. But, and I think, maybe origin as well, but definitely Maximus the Confessor and what I read Ambiguum 10 recently. The vision of the fall of humanity, which, also in, you know, whether you think of it literally or mythopoetically or both, comes with this division of the sexes, but also the phenomenon of death. And prior to
Mm.
that, death was not a thing, because all was the sublime organism of the angelic hierarchies and, encircling the Godhead and praising and its glory. And so, I guess like if we're gonna think with Steiner and like consider like what the sacrifice of Christ signifies, um, it's partially contingent, being able to understand that, according to Steiner, like um, means we also have to understand what like death means and death, like the resurrection being this kind of catastrophe that is supposed to give confidence and sort of restore a sense of identity for fallen humanity, of our angelic origins and the ultimate unreality of death. And so like I think that it comes down to for us, like there's so many today that live in squalor and poverty and do not have a comfortable life. Um, but there are many, compared to centuries past, more than ever before, that are very comfortable, and like indulgent, and it's nice to be indulgent and comfortable. But, in this cosmology, this world is a fallen world, right? It's not, it's,
Yeah.
and this sort of, even the sense of selfhood that we have, um, not necessarily individuality, but like this sense of being a separate self, like with these um, just self-indulgence, I guess, is for Steiner and people, thinkers like him, a kind of uh, inheritance, that the fallen angels have bestowed to us. And so, in a way, like if you have all this in mind when thinking about sacrifice in our context, really for someone like Steiner, like to make a sacrifice, by dedicating your life to more than just the pursuit of pleasure, is actually more in congruence with who you really are as a divine being, and is a kind of dedication to restoring the world to its divinity. So
Right.
that's like, so in a way, you know, when if we bemoan sacrifice, it's partially because we've become so accustomed to conceiving of ourselves in according to Lucifer, according to the image
Mhm.
of Lucifer. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Right. Like, what do gods do with all that power that they supposedly have? Like, they're not using all the power to be even more like acquisitive and greedy. There's no gods sacrifice themselves. That's what they do.
and they
They
give
self-empty. Yeah.
like because also like in Steiner's cosmology, like when the higher beings give, they also evolve further and like they like delight in the
Yeah.
giving and
So there is no transformation without the sacrifice, without the giving.
yeah, and it's not just like a kind of um impoverishing act. Like I feel like the way, it's a gift exchange. Like there's something that is received in return, not that you give it expecting that, but yeah.
Yeah. Um, so there's a whole cosmology, I feel like, that you need to have in order to make sense of the Christ event, um, as more than just a cultural symbol that does stuff to human society and human individuals. Like, because you can understand it psychologically, you can understand it sociologically, and that's important. But Christianity is also this, um, Christ rather is this cosmic power that uh, changed the nature of the human being and the earth, right? And also the nature of the hierarchies, um, the nature of the spiritual world by doing this thing that happened, the incarnation and the resurrection. Um,
Well, the crucifixion.
and
Because
the, yeah,
like one thing that I found really compelling in Steiner is that he says like because of Christ, because he'll like talk about the angels, he'll call them the gods as well. And he's like, there were like gods who didn't know anything about death until one of their own died
right.
as a human, and that had this like so and like this is where like this kind of reactionary Christianity, which thinks of itself in competition with other like spiritual traditions, like kind of falls apart because in this perspective, like everything that predates Christianity or maybe is even like simultaneous with it isn't necessarily in competition with it. Like it is like these other traditions are like different traditions of like relating to spirits that are real, and
Hmm.
um,
Yeah. Like all of the mystery religions across the continents and what, Schelling would call the mythological process that was underway in the millennia and centuries prior to Christianity, the what was being revealed in those mystery religions was the coming of the logos to the earth, right? The gradual approach of the Son of God, Um, and Steiner picks that up too and um, understands Christianity as like the inevitable outcome of an evolutionary process that began with all the pagan traditions and
well,
Buddhism.
and
Yeah,
also just to say that like I wouldn't want to say that like all of, and I think you agree that everything about those religions and rituals and myths and festivals all revolve around Christ. Because right, because like Barfield says this
yeah,
in his essays, like he's like riffing with Plato. Plato's like, you don't want to try and get to know the one before you know the many, or at least like you have to have the many with the one in order to really like appreciate the one. And
yeah,
yeah, so anyway,
yeah. Um, but so we need, if we're gonna have a religion, it needs to be like a Christian neo-paganism and not just Christianity against paganism or something.
yeah.
Um, but when we think about the resurrection, if we have a cosmology that can accommodate that as a fact or a reality, um, I wonder how we think about that because it seems I don't know how to think about it. Is it the physical body of Christ that resurrects? Well, it seems like the body wasn't in the tomb anymore, according to the stories. But is the resurrection body some other type of body? Is it the etheric body? Is it um, what's going on there? And what do we take away from that? Because I don't expect my physical body to resurrect one day. I think rather of, the way Steiner talks about Christ entering into the etheric body of the earth and into therefore our etheric bodies as earthly humans. that what's immortal in us is something we discover after the death of our physical bodies, after the higher members, the etheric, astral, and ego leave our corpse, which is part of the earth and remains part of the earth, and will return to the earth and reassemble a physical body out of the earth. And so it's not like we're when we die. So and what I'm trying to get to here is that the resurrection body seems to me to be a way of, and Christ's resurrection, of pointing to the reality of reincarnation. That death is not the end. You do leave your actual physical body behind, but your etheric, astral, and ego go into the spiritual world and contribute to the process that gives rise to, the body that you will reincarnate into in your next lifetime. Um, and so, if the cosmology where the Christ event makes sense includes reincarnation, it's like there's so much more um, going on here metaphysically than you typically get at any Christian church that I know about.
Yeah.
um, and so we've gotten kind of esoteric here, but I think it's part of what Steiner seemed to be trying to say was that this can't be esoteric anymore. Like we need to actually integrate this with the broader culture as a form of resistance to a materialistic tendency that will otherwise divert the evolutionary process and from its intended direction. Um, so
Hmm.
Christianity and reincarnation, and so the Christ event as um, a doorway into the reality of reincarnation, I think is what I'm trying to point to. And Origin was already onto this, a long time ago,
Hmm.
and Steiner picks that up again. Um, but how do you understand the resurrection? Like, do you agree that do we have to think about this etherically and not physically, or have you thought about that?
Well, I'm not exactly sure about the specifics of that.
Yeah.
But I mean, I guess I
Mm.
think that you know, one of the things that seems important about like, that we might like to see in the revival of Christianity is not, beyond like the reactionary or the like social technology utilitarian interpretations that like there'd be a real um Barfield has this phrase that I know you've quoted before. There will not be a revival of Christianity until a manual of science can't help but refer to the incarnation. So, like,
Right.
we have to be able to like reconcile natural evolution with Christianity, and
Right.
and and so, I feel like, at least according, in the kind of all the way back to someone like Maximus the Confessor, and then like in Steiner and Barfield, the like modern interpretation after like the theory of evolution has already been introduced. Uh, there's this understanding of the life of Christ as this gift to humanity that helps to put us back in the train of providence, and that we have this potential to participate in that out of our own freedom. And so I guess, yeah, the resurrection is a kind of image of what we have this opportunity to participate in for the whole cosmos. And so I think of the resurrection body in connection with that, like this potential of that is, I think, this quote that Tara Burton has from Peter Thiel, however you pronounce it, that there is this aspiration, and I feel like we should, I think it is right to try and actualize the best conditions on earth, but while at the same time knowing that it will not ever be our paradise, but that it is a kind of moving towards the eschatological vision which is actually beyond space and time and is a kind of reunion with the eternal, and that is asymptotic. It's beyond what we could imagine. But I think Steiner, in he's got Saturn, old sun, moon, then the Earth period that we're in, which is like he depicts it as a U, and we're at the nadir of the U, at the most fallen place. But then there's this potential ascent, and the last one is called Vulcan, and who is it? Paracelsus. I'm sure others as well, but Paracelsus in one of his texts talks about Vulcan as like the being, like the divinity that the alchemist participates in the alchemical process of the like raising up of the substance into perfection. And so that's what I think of as like that's at least what I say in my dissertation, that I think of this as like what Steiner means when he calls this distant epoch, which is like the inverse of Saturn, and Saturn is like when the angelic hierarchies like turn themselves inside out and constitute time. That Vulcan would be like the inversion of that, where time like folds back into eternity. And so like that, this is where I feel like this is really important for modern people because like in a secular age, like and people have referenced Dominion. I'm not sure who wrote that, but just these texts
Tom
that show,
Holland, I think
yeah,
Tom Holland. Yeah.
that show this genealogical connection between like liberal values and secular society and modern science, genealogically bound up with Christianity, that in a secular age, Taylor ties like the emergence of the buffered self and this kind of moral outlook, which needs to like uh, uh, um, present itself like dealing with reality in this kind of sober, mature way, and so like finds it cringe to like profess like a faith in Christ, like in the kind of truer sense of like this absurd event, at least absurd for the secular materialist mindset, um, that that this modern selfhood, and this sort of aspirational character and even kind of Promethean character is also bound up with Christ, like in history, and like the way that it gave a kind of like confidence and centering effect for human personality, and just like the kind of forging of the individual relationship with Christ, like as that like
Yeah.
that transformative uh, process. And I just wanted to say that like in connection with what we're talking about, Steiner and the resurrection body and this kind of like crazy vision of the future, like it really breaks all of it because like if like the fall includes this division into the sexes and the emergence of like the phenomenon of death, which didn't exist before, then everything that we think of as conventional in Western culture like is contingent and isn't necessarily essential to Christianity, except for the parts that are about freedom and love, I think. And so, really, like to participate in, I think there's something true in like what Peter Thiel says when he says that Christianity, what does he say? Let me just find it real quick. Um, the Christian intuition is always that we should be on the side of transformation and not just taking the world as it is. I think there's something true in that. And maybe, that the transhumanists with their aspirations are, they're bound up with being conditioned according to a belief in transcendence, even if they're unconscious of it, but they're trying to translate it always into a kind of material register. Um, and then finally, what Tara Burton kind of is critical of is what she describes as the kind of ultimately like hermetic, technological, transhumanist um, aspiration of memetic Christianity. But I feel like that is not really taking into account the what you get with Steiner and Barfield and somewhat Taylor, even though he doesn't necessarily come right out and say it, that this kind of empowerment of selfhood is like part of like the ongoing revelation. And even if it was a kind of like partially like the separate self, a gift of like the fallen angels, like it can be redeemed through like our kind of sacrifice of that, right? To participate in the like bringing the machine of destiny back into tow with providence.
Hmm.
And so that I think that's so important for young people like who like are living in a crisis, like a civilization that does feel like it's declining. Like what are we supposed to do?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, everyone talks about the need for a new story, right? Um,
Yeah.
with maybe Thomas Berry beginning in the 70s, and now it's literally everybody who, thinks that there's a meaning crisis would say we need a new story, and that story is a powerful s- psychosocial technology, and that element is there in Christianity. It's true. Um, I think it's a uniquely historical um, vision that I mean, all the I guess the Abrahamic faiths are historical, and so Christianity, Judaism, and Islam seem all bound up together in this epic story that you don't get the same sense from a kind of Buddhism as the other religion that comes to mind immediately of a sense of a historical drama that's unfolding. Um, there are still narrative elements, of course, like the story of Siddhartha Gautama and like his awakening is an important part of what makes Buddhism compelling to know that it's possible. Like there was a man who did it, and so we can all do it. Um, and so there's, of course, that like minimal historical component to it. But yeah, this idea of um, like the creation, the fall, and redemption, that three phase, great code, as Sean Kelly, our friend Sean Kelly, refers to it in his book, um, Coming Home. Um, it's really compelling, and it's that Trinitarian structure is there in everything.
Yes.
And other religious traditions recognize the Trinitarian structure too, um,
But it's
and
not necessarily like
historicized. Yeah, right. But yeah, Teilhard talks about the importance of finding a way to have a common faith in the future because he saw how secularism, like Marxism, he saw wanted to try to do that. Various forms of totalitarianism in his day were trying to generate a common faith in a kind of a future, but they were too exclusive and not inclusive enough, not universal enough. Um, but Teilhard admitted to being impressed by how communism and fascism mobilized large millions of people for a common aim because he saw the capitalist West as because it became so individualized, we were losing the ability to have a common faith in anything or in a common future. And so he talks about, he offers his version of the story of cosmogenesis that integrates Christianity and evolution so that all of cosmic history is a gradual process of incarnation. He doesn't really tell us how to think of the particular event that happened 2,000 years ago. That's not Teilhard's focus, but he's reading the incarnation um, as a process of cosmogenesis, and he's reading what he calls anthropogenesis as a movement towards Christ, as a Christogenesis, right? So he says anthropogenesis is Christogenesis. The noosphere is the omega point, is the emergence of um, this Christ mind on the planet that allows us all to enter into a deeper communion with each other. Um, he says, I'll just read a line from him because it's so, this is Christian neo-paganism. Um, it's from Toward the Future, a collection of his essays. He says, for that person who recognizes Christogenesis as the end of anthropogenesis, everything in every element and event of the universe is bathed in light and warmth. Everything becomes animate and a fit object for love and worship. So it's the sanctification of the whole cosmos, as well as the human soul. And our common faith in a future of the earth for Teilhard can be driven by this sense that like inevitably, even the material world is rushing towards communion. Um, and he's not denying any of science. He's saying, just look at all the scientific evidence. It's totally compatible with this view of a future um, that is necessarily going to involve increased consciousness and complexity. And consciousness and complexity means increased communion, increased intimacy. It's such a beautiful vision, and um, I think Teilhard can be and should be reappropriated from the transhumanists because there's this whole spiritual side of it that's not just about psychotechnology or social technology, but about the transformation of human hearts, and so um, I just want to emphasize that aspect of his work because I know he's so influential for the transhumanist movement. There's more there if you scratch just a little bit beneath the surface.
Yeah. Yeah, and right, like a lot of cataclysm and darkness. And I mean, what
Yeah.
kind of future do we have before us? It might not be a very comfortable one, and maybe it won't ever. I mean, maybe we've passed the most comfortable phase of human existence on the earth, or maybe we're passing through it now. I think that's just something to keep in mind. And also, maybe one thing we should also touch upon before we end is just the evil, and
Yeah.
how, one of the negative, one of the worrisome things about like a memetic Christianity, which doesn't actually, which isn't really referring to its moral source, like in the sense of like believing in the second person of the Trinity, like becoming the logos, like this, and just to kind of touch back to something you mentioned at the beginning when it comes to like faith, and the incredible and the absurd, like there are certain things that we can consider not necessarily, like I feel like it's more like the testament of history that can be a kind of rational pointing out exercise for developing some confidence in the faith in the life of Christ and the incarnation, crucifixion, and resurrection. But when it comes to like this idea of the logos, I feel like the very possibility of science, that the world is intelligible, that the world can become more
Mm.
intelligible to us, the fact that we can communicate with each other intelligibly and even translate across languages, that this suggests something like an ontic logos. And uh, also, uh, well, this isn't necessarily bound up with the logos per se, but like a transcendent divinity, I think, is all bound up with like our notions of creativity and novelty, and that something could, something genuinely new could come into existence, and also that we could be free, that we could not just be bound, and which is something I think if you really attend to your everyday experience, you could recognize, like that we have the possibility to be otherwise. Uh,
Mm.
but oh man, what was I saying when I before I brought that up?
Evil.
Oh, evil.
I mean, the three things you listed, evil, logos as intelligibility, important for science, and the importance of transcendence. Those, yeah, we should
Oh, okay, yeah.
address that.
Oh, okay, here we go. Yeah. So like one of the worrisome things about a mimetic Christianity that isn't
Mm.
genuinely connected with the moral source, like the transcendent Godhead, that this could just turn into, as it's being leveraged, a social technology for othering certain groups and imposing certain norms that have become historically associated with Christianity. I mean, it could be, transcendence co-opted for finite power. And I
Oh,
think the two authors that we've referenced, Evans and Burton, are both, that's part of their concerns.
yeah,
And
yeah.
so. evil, I feel like evil is something that we can make more comprehensible through this recognition of like a good
Mhm.
beyond being. Because then like evil, like it doesn't necessarily have to be like this kind of good evil parallelism. Um,
Right.
because then it's more that the evil is operating at a more in a finite register, and has willed its severance from the providential course of things. And so I don't know. I feel like, one of the dangers of the revival of Christianity is the othering, and and what's inevitable, I think, is this renewed recognition of transpersonal forces, and that evil is one of them, and but it's important to remember, I think, or to, I guess, to keep that transpersonal characterization in mind, because then we're less likely to like make people just evil, right? Like rather they're
Right.
like,
Scapegoat.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's right. Evil evil is real, and what is evil? It's what happens when a human creature tries to appropriate the power of God for a creaturely purpose, which is
Yeah,
which,
not congruent with the good. Yeah.
yeah, in other words, the using of like Constantine, the using of Christianity as a symbol to enhance the power of empire. Um, the way that this memetic Christianity is used in a utilitarian way to defend the West against its enemies or whatever, is, you know, it's not stemming from that ethic of sacrifice. It's stemming from it does have moral sources. It's a social Darwinism, basically. It's like the
But is that really a moral source? I don't know if I would
it's not
call
a transcendent moral source, but it's
it.
a sense of grounding, justifying
Yeah.
one's actions in a story that one takes as true, which is that all of life is reducible to the struggle for existence among competing individuals, and the strong survive. And so let's be the strong ones, you know? Um, that's the moral of the story from a materialist point of view. And you could, well, that's not moral, yeah, but it's still it's a motivation, a justification. Like we're just animals, you know? Um, and we're struggling with each other, and Christianity is is good for morale. So let's swallow it, you know? Um, but that appropriation of uh, symbols of transcendence for worldly power, I think, is a good example of what evil is.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and evil is also what happens when which is part of this Darwinian, poor Darwin. I mean, I really do love Darwin. It's part of this reductive social um, um, biologically reductionistic view of human nature, where we think it's all about this group competing against that group, and within groups, individuals competing against each other, and it's evil's always projected onto the other. It's like, oh, those are the evil ones. That's the out group. We must outcompete them. We must destroy them. We must be the winners. It's like evil is created when we project it onto others, because evil lives, as a potential in all of us. We're free beings, which means we have evil as a
Right.
potential in us, just as we have good as a potential in us. Original grace and original sin sit side by side in every human heart. There's like,
Yeah.
no, you can't get it out of you and just put it over there with those bad people. That is how evil takes root, is when you do that. So we need deeper moral sources, transcendent moral sources, non-competitive transcendence. I like the way you put that earlier. Is that from
That's
Taylor?
from, well, no, I don't know who would have coined it, but I got it from Jacob Sherman.
Okay, yeah. It's good because that gets at it. There's plenty to go around. We don't need to fight over it. Right?
Yeah, well, it's just not of this world.
Yeah.
It's like the kingdom is not of this world. So like, whatever, Caesar.
But it's also um,
It permeates the world.
omnipresent. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It
Um,
is. Yes, Jake also repeats another scholar saying the finite, or sorry, the superlative mode of immanence, transcendence,
right.
is
Right.
superlative.
Which I think is what the logos is attempting to
Yeah,
signify, right?
yeah.
Is the immanence of this divine
But
transcendence,
Christ, yeah,
the
yeah.
intelligibility in nature and the intelligence in the scientist that knows nature. Like logos is active um, as a formative power, you could say. It's a form of significance and meaning that's not reducible to human language because human language is itself a expression of it, um, rather than this nominalist thing where we think all the intelligibility in the universe is just a construct of the fact that we smart primates started using
Yeah,
mouth noises and squiggles on paper to create meaning. We have meaning because there's logos in the universe.
yeah, yeah. And it's like a living thing. It's not
Yeah.
just like a code that we have to decipher. I just want to
Yeah.
say, like, in connection with this, like, because you could say, like, this is Barfield's whole thing with language and poetic diction that Barfield's entry into the evolution of consciousness was looking at the history of language as like the sort of fossil record of the progressive incarnation of the logos and the kind of with self-consciousness comes this like capacity to creatively wield language, which is like our way of negotiating the like ongoing unfolding of the logos. And so I feel like that, like the same way in which we, participate in the intelligibility of life, in human communication and what have you, um, you know, by being creative and not like always interpreting everything literally. Like, I feel like this is like there's a kind of analogy here with like our life experience and how we relate to evil in the world. And because one of the things with Steiner is that like evil, he thinks of evil as like either one way of characterizing it is like it's either something that's too soon or it's trying to maintain something that was past and no longer appropriate. But that somehow, like, what might be evil in one time is later like redirected and transmuted for the good. And so I think we just have to be careful, about like, like with transhumanists, for example, like maybe there's some significance that of those of certain technological projects that will be helpful in the future. Who knows? And just to be kind of humble about like because another thing that is unique about Steiner and Barfield's conception of Christianity and cosmic evolution is that we each have our own individual, irreducibly unique karmic stream, and like what
Mm.
might look evil, from my point of view, might have some kind of like deeply mysterious karmic necessity, and so I feel like this is important, like when it comes to the revival of Christianity, is this kind of humility and like rather than always kind of interpreting things according to our conditioning and our experience, like sort of like trying to like always root into your relationship with Christ,
Yeah.
and live out of love. And yes, and I feel like this relates to other things like gender and sex and like things just like the vision of the future having this kind of inverse relationship to the past, like in the sense that like if the fall involved a division of the sexes and
Mm.
the emergence of death, then does the future involve a kind of overcoming of that division of the sexes and also the phenomenon of death? You know. So anyway,
Yeah.
yeah,
I think sex and death are big sources of cultural repression that certainly inhibit a more genuine encounter with the ground of being. which if the ground of being is logos or Christ or this divine love, then I think, yeah, we would be a little bit more flexible with our sense of sexual division and also the division between life and death, and see death as a transformation, um, not as an end, or a um, eradication. But yeah, just to emphasize your point about evil. I think like the shortest road to hell is the attempt to eradicate it. And instead of thinking of evil as something you might be able to eradicate, it's something that, and this is why, turn the other cheek and love thy enemies is such an important teaching. Um, I think instead of imagining that evil could be eradicated, you do have to just open your heart to it and allow it to be transformed, even if that means sacrificing yourself. Um, which is I mean, it's almost an impossible lesson to try to internalize, um, because we do have this biological aspect of ourselves that wants to survive, um,
I
and that
call
wants,
it the fallen.
yeah,
Yeah,
the flesh wants, as Paul would refer to it, has this instinct of self-preservation, and that's good. It's natural.
yeah,
Um, at the same time, I think when Teilhard talks about Christogenesis, anthropogenesis is Christogenesis, and the path to Christogenesis is through deeper personalization, deeper individualization of the human. Um, that's how you reach this cosmic Christ love energy for Teilhard. Um, but it's like we have to live our lives as individuals in service of the human, and to see that like there is one, we're all members of one body, and yeah, we have our individual karmic streams, but reincarnation is a temporary uh, phase of the evolutionary process of the human being, that eventually um, all of these different karmic paths are woven back together, and we are that one anthropos, right? Um, and so even now in this phase, while it's very important for us to have our individual journeys, we're on a journey to a common um, omega in Teilhard sense, that everything we do is either in service to or um, derogates from, um, and so that's the common vision and common faith, and that's the faith in a common future that I think we're trying to articulate here, and avoid these appropriations of the symbolism. It's so powerful. This symbolism is so powerful, but um, we have to avoid these appropriations without demonizing. Like, I'm not trying to say transhumanists are evil.
yeah,
I think that temptation is one, like, I think technology is great. But we have to make sure that it's in service of the human, and not in service of the accumulation of wealth or power or all the other ways that very often our secular pursuits end up being captured by these vices rather than our virtues. Well, that was yeah, it was like the metaphysics of Christ, I guess, is what we ended up talking about, which is very interesting. A quote or something?
well, it's like from Barfield, and it's kind of related to the Tara Burton piece. Well, let me read hers first, and then I will like juxtapose it lovingly. All right. Memetic Christianity chills me both within and beyond the cultural war in which its proponents see it as a necessary weapon. It is the same chill I get when I think about their ostensible rivals, the remixers of the post-relativism age. It is not merely the notion that a useful, if false, or at least inconclusive idea, if spread among an intellectually acquiescent populace by necessarily a knowing elite, might be an efficient mechanism of social order. It is, even more worryingly, a religiously tinged affirmation of the bleakest tenets of our post-truth age, that the memetic and the metaphorical are realer than and prior to the particular or the literally true. Jesus Christ becomes, in this rendering, merely a paradigmatic rendering of the God-man, the human being who, through knowledge, through will, through innovation, through the creative power of the so-called Western intellectual tradition, succeeds in transhumanist self-divinization. If Christianity is not literally true, in other words, it becomes instead a kind of hermetic magical transhumanism in which Jesus is a mere metaphor for the divine in all of us. So like, with Barfield and Steiner, it's like actually that the literal in particular is the archetypal metaphorical like become historical fact in the person
Right.
of Christ. So it is like it's both. And so I feel like I really appreciate her critique, but it doesn't there's like read the great post wondering like, well, what is the future of Christianity and how does Christianity deal with modernity and Barfield in this great essay called The Fall in Man and Nature, he's like wondering like what would human subjectivity be like if there hadn't been the fall and we hadn't sort of inherited this kind of egoism from Lucifer. And he says, what does he say? He's quoting Steiner, who says, the thing of greatest importance when we begin to approach the spiritual world is that we learn to regard ourselves absolutely with the same indifference with which we regard the outer world."
Mm.
And Barfield's like,
Mm.
pause on it, think it through. What are we to make of such a hard saying? What sort of human being am I asked to become? Would it not be better to turn back before it is too late? How can I be indifferent to myself? I am myself. Who then is this I, which is to do the being indifferent? And so, like I think as, Steiner and Barfield refer to Christ as the representative of the human being. And,
Mm.
if the human hadn't fallen, Barfield imagines that like the kind of the angelic form of consciousness would like constitute this like experience of like being full of other beings and like living in accordance with that.
And
So,
so not being free.
well, um, we're free now. So, like, I
Right.
think that,
If we were angels, we wouldn't be free because we'd
well,
be in
yeah,
this so entangled, with others, a member of a choir, as it were.
yeah. Well, yeah. And so I think the point is that we have this selfhood now, and it's what grants us this freedom to come into a conscious relationship with the spirit world. And that is a way of thinking about what it means to participate in this self-divinization process, you know, after the like modern emergence of this buffered selfhood, like that is no longer that is cut off from this necessary like course of providence, um, but that can choose to participate in it
Mm.
willingly.
Right. Yeah. So it's like you give yourself away to gain yourself in a way.
Yeah, yeah. And
Um,
so like the hermetic self-divinizing aspirations of transhumanists are kind of like edging on this, but misinterpreting it maybe. Yeah.
yeah. Anything from Jonelle Schickler, or should we?
Well, actually, maybe that's a good place to end because it's definitely relevant. Let me just find it real quick.
Metaphysics as Christology.
And this is kind of more like this is like including that, but also connecting it with natural evolution. So I wrote Steiner's account of cosmogenesis of Earth evolution in particular, with its original Edenic unity of Adamic humanity, followed by a fall into differentiation and reincarnation, continues this tradition we were talking about earlier with regard to Maximus. Since for Steiner, as the late Schickler writes, humans will experience their individuality ever more strongly as society disintegrates and man is thrown back upon himself. It will become increasingly important for him to be able to situate this individuality within a broader evolutionary sequence. to identify himself not simply with his immediate cultural and social past, but also with an extended individual one. So, like that's reincarnation, but as well as like a spirit being, like
Mm.
who's fallen from the bosom of the sublime angelic organism.
Yeah. So that was a Schickler quote, or that was
Yeah,
your?
that was from a footnote where he's sort of like
Oh.
talking about Steiner bringing Nietzsche forward.
Okay, right. Yeah. Amazing. Yeah. No, that brings a lot together. That's perfect. Good
Yeah,
place to end.
it's great to chat.
Yeah.